It is my honor to be here representing my team, consisting of myself and Dr. Jane Turner, and I'll be presenting early findings of our project into placemaking in terraforming games as relationship building practice. So we are currently in the midst of an ongoing shift towards digitally mediated relationships, and this is one that has been greatly accelerated by COVID-19. So during the pandemic, we saw several games, cooperative games, explode in popularity, such as I'm sure many of us would remember how Animal Crossing New Horizons completely took over the internet for the month of March or April. And we also saw the Minecraft community project Build the Earth emerge, where people recreated entire cities and even countries in Minecraft. So over on the right side, that's my home country of Singapore recreated in Minecraft. So what all of this does is testify to the fact that people see value in virtual places as spaces of co-presence in lieu of physical togetherness. So during those times when we could not actually meet in person. Simultaneously with that, there's been a growing body of research into how games facilitate social connection by creating scenarios of interdependence among players. So it is clear that games are valuable social spaces. It's quite undeniable. So considering how humans inhabit games asks us to think about space in new ways. And I guess the word of the day is phenomenology, because to this point, phenomenology of place will be very important. So I just want you to think about the building you're in right now. And I want you to consider these two things about it. First, how tall is it in meters from the ground to the top of its roof? Do you have a clear answer for that? And how about this? From where you are right now, how do you navigate to the building's exit? Do you have a clear answer for that? So just thinking on that. The phenomenology of place emerges in that tension between these different ways of understanding space. So in the past century, there was a tendency, particularly prior to the 70s, of understanding space rationally through these abstractions of dimensions, X, Y, Z, width, depth, height. But then around the 70s, and ever since then, many scholars have proposed to understand space instead through the lens of how humans experience it. So we make sense of space not through the abstractions of measurement, but typically as experiences where parts of this space receive meaning from relationships with the whole. So Christian Norberg Schulz describes in his book Genius Loci how we create places as systems of enclosures separating inside from outside. So inside and outside being complements that we only understand in relation to each other. We establish these centers of reference in relation to which we apprehend the rest of the world. So when I say, this is my home, and that shop is 2 minutes from my home, then my home becomes the center of reference and from which the rest of the world radiates in terms of navigation. So we also develop knowledge of space through nets of habits. So one of my favorite philosophers, Yves Tuan, says, calls these habit fields. So like when I asked you to consider how you're walking out of the building, you're understanding space through habit. And of course, then there's all these processes of making space legible through associative memories and emotional connections. So, where Ralph calls place attachments. So, what has transpired in this space in relation to me, and how do I feel in that space? So all of these cognitive processes are usually complemented by acts of physical customization as well. So we adjust space to suit those needs and habits as they emerge. So for example, as we realize that, say, a table is in the way of our natural path of navigation across the space, we might shift it to a different location And in that manner, the space kind of learns from our habits and evolves to better align with it. So collectively, we might call these processes placemaking. Now, when we think about places as centered around human experience, it's self-evident that we apprehend game spaces through similar processes of movement, habit formation, and emotional attachment, albeit mediated through an avatar which we self-identify with. So Ash and Gallagher have explored how games can then become cultural geographies where both endemic cultural moments emerge, but also where cultural phenomena from the so-called serious world then propagate and replicate. So in this basis, we can then venture to apply the phenomenology of place to game worlds and to think about placemaking within game worlds. So placemaking actually has been studied in game development, but typically from the point of view of the developer. So for example, Alvarez and Duarte look at how game developers design space in games, so administering that space from the top down. There is relatively less research into a bottom-up player-driven process of placemaking, and that is where our research sits. In that context, we ask these questions. How do players cooperatively build places in terraforming games? And what can this tell us about how people relationally make meaning in space? So you may not be familiar with the term terraforming game. That's because we coined it for this reason. Most people are probably familiar with the concept of sandbox games, particularly in the games research space. So these are games which are defined, in the words of Breslin, by undirected free play. So players are given the agency to engage with the game space and to play in whatever way they fancy. It's quite a broad genre, even from that description you can tell, and it encompasses games as diverse as the action-adventure Grand Theft Auto series, and also simulator games like The Sims or SimCity. So for our research, we are interested in a subset of these games where an important part of that free play includes the freedom to configure the game space and on a highly granular level, usually on a block-based basis. So to describe this, we came up with the term terraforming games, which is meant to encompass both the 2D and 3D forms, which terms like voxel can't really capture. And it includes games like Minecraft by Mojang and Terraria by Relogic as examples. So what makes them especially amenable to our research interests is that they make space configuration very accessible. So you don't need specialist knowledge or tool sets. You don't need to know how to 3D model or to mod games to create places of your own design. You can just build them. And they're also flexible in the sense that because they're block-based, they don't prescribe architectural styles from the top down once again. So builders can typically realize their visions to a higher fidelity. Now, for our study, we have decided to go with the game Terraria, particularly because I can't do 3D graphics, which will be a bit of a pain when VR becomes the norm, but that's a digression. So this is a side-scrolling terraforming game where the player begins in a procedurally generated world of natural landscapes, so it is completely devoid of civilization. Also a bunch of problematic tropes, but that's another digression, which we can discuss later. So block-based mechanics really do encourage careful space configuration activities. So because you have to break and place blocks block by block by block, it becomes a very absorbing, if time-consuming process. So it's almost by design that building in games like Terraria requires care and effort. So in our study, we are observing and analyzing how participants play in Terraria through 4 3-hour sessions. and I am participating as a guide and facilitator of gameplay. So we've just commenced this study and kind of going into it not knowing what we're going to observe, but we've only completed 2 of the 4 sessions, but we already have encountered some very interesting findings, which I am going to describe in the next slides. I'm just going to skip this one. All right, so this is the world at the start of the first session. So you can kind of see this sort of hastily built enclosure that the players actually constructed to keep hostile creatures out of the way, because on that first night, players were repeatedly being interrupted and killed by these hostile zombies, and they could not progress on the game in any front. So they essentially built this to secure the space against hostile mobs so they could start doing stuff. This is the same base, but at the end of the first session, so 3 hours into gameplay, yeah, so you can kind of see that they're starting to scaffold the structure of that house there. And you can also see even within that enclosure that the space is starting to be differentiated into various rooms of different sizes and description, but some parts of it are clearly still not complete. And also, like, some facilities have been placed at the bottom right there. And this is the game at the end of session 2, 6 hours into gameplay. So the players have started to elaborate on the various rooms inside the house. So they've added decorative furniture, items like lighting fixtures and such. And you can already see that each room is kind of being distinguished into a place of a sort of different character, with like a sort of kitchen area in the bottom left and a big ballroom type thing in the top right. And yeah, one of the players put in the word boop at the top when they realized they could make letters. I just thought that was a funny detail. Yeah, so as we've been doing this observation, we have noted that the game mechanics of Terraria really do assert the way players experience space in quite a profound way. So hostile creatures spawn on the grass outside and aggrieve the players, which prevents them from progressing. So the only reliable defense, as I described earlier, is for them to build enclosures of walls and floors. At the same time, the game also has stationary elements like crafting tables and storage chests. So kind of like Minecraft, if you're more familiar with that. And recovery points, which the players must often access repeatedly. Like if they go out in the world and then they get like hurt or something, they return to these beds to recover their health. So once the players created this enclosure, it was interesting to note that they started to consolidate all their crafting, storage, and recovery points within that enclosure. So thereafter, the players routinely returned to this shelter to shelter from nighttime creatures. So their habits began to pivot around that space. So already you can see what we were describing earlier with the idea of habit fields and place attachments. Whereas in the physical world, what asserts our sense of outside is the exposure to elements. So, like, we don't live outdoors because of the risk of rain or heat, right? But then in this game, where things like rain and heat don't have a mechanical impact, it is these hostile creatures that assert the experience of the outside in kind of the way that we see monsters in fiction marking the boundaries of the other. So that I could go into a bit of a critical commentary about that trope, but for now we're just going to take it as given in the game. The inside then becomes a complement of the outside. It's this safe, stable space, and that this base in essence becomes a spatial anchor point around which the player's perception of the world then kind of became organized. They would refer to things like the forest to the west of the house or the desert to the east of the house. So like it was becoming the reference point and a sort of center of dwelling for them. So, in the midst of all of this, we very much observed many practices of cultivation and care among the players, which, in a sense, as outlined earlier, is almost inherent in the mechanics. Structures being built block by block. So on the right, if you look over there, you see as 4 progression images of the players collaboratively developing a stairwell over the course of the entire playtime, like 6 hours. So as the players' needs evolved, they realized they wanted more rooms in the house to put like different paintings. They progressively developed this staircase and added more floors to the house. And this was not like one specific player's project. It was everyone participated in developing this. So different blocks and furniture in Terraria actually have different experiential properties. So they have different colors, textures, and transparency, which of course, like these associations are brought in from personal and cultural context, and that might actually differ between different players. So over time, the players did seem to develop place attachments and habits, and as they did so, they revised the space to attune it to those habits. So we found that players definitely preferred to preserve and adjust existing structures rather than simply rebuilding them from scratch. So what really exemplifies this is that mezzanine floor that you see in the middle of like each of these 4 images. It started as an incidental dip in that enclosure, and then instead of evening the ceiling out, they decided to develop it into a corridor of its own. And then when it became clear it was really hard to access the corridor from the left side of the house because you had to go up the stairs and then down, rather than break down the whole thing and demolish it, they rather they replaced the flooring with platforms so you could just simply jump up into it. So yeah, some acts of customization were also very much not motivated by practical need, but rather seemed to be of sentimental attachment and aesthetic preference for the space. So some features had no functional purpose other than seemingly to anchor relationships with space, with the world outside of the players, and with each other. So one of the players actually planted sunflowers on the ground on the very first in-game day of play, and even after the house was built around it, the players preserved the flower in its original location. And we have yet to we are still pending the end of the study. So once we've debriefed, I would be able to say like exactly why that was. But this happened without any verbal communication about it. Everyone just decided they wanted to keep the flower there. So, altogether, we are seeing that meaning making happens as a social negotiatory process that includes an awareness of the sociality of the game. Players understand that they are playing a shared sort of public space, and changes to the place impact all players' experience of it. So, what we've seen is that players are very often in the process of negotiating changes to the space. So, this ballroom that you have pictures of on the right was one player's idea, but they didn't just start building it. They first scaffolded it with dirt like so, and asked the other players for their opinion before they started. So and then once that started, the building of the ballroom itself became a collaborative process where players started to pool their resources together and also to offer suggestions for what materials should like go in the wall, and like where to place, what kinds of lighting to place in there, etc. So where multiple players configure the same space, they all have a stake in shaping it, and they bring their own processes of meaning making and their own preconceived understandings of placemaking into the process. So verbal conversation almost becomes how players are ensured that their respective understandings of space and place are being sustained and also syncretized with each other's. So this place is being made as a collective shared process of meaning making among several people. So yeah, due to the study isn't really done yet due to practical limitations. As I mentioned, we didn't do a 3D study, but there is no doubt that the findings would be extended in a 3D world where there is literally another dimension of movement. Also, in the near future, we would like to, at the close of the study, conduct more detailed analysis of gameplay, as well as like conversations that take place during building, maybe applying like a linguistic ethnography to the transcripts. So this is all still incomplete, but we are very excited to proceed with it. So that's about it for my presentation. Thanks for listening. And I guess if there's any time for questions, now let's move on to that.